I really wrote this because of two real main things. Is one, that the Asian American community is at an inflection point because of all of the things that it's experienced politically. And then also, I think, and you experienced a little bit of this, is that the legislature and California politics is also at an inflection point where you have massive turnover of legislators, massive turnover in staff, and there's really nothing, very few things that outside of, say, Chris McKaylee's books that curate the contemporary legislative experience and political experience in California. A lot of stuff is like Woolley Brown days or even further back, and those are great reads, but nothing really talks about contemporary California politics.
Hello and welcome again to Sacktown Talks. Today we're glad to be joined by Bill Wong to talk about his new book, Better to Win. Bill, how's it going? Thanks for joining us.
Going fantastic. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it seems like you've been really busy kind of promoting the book. You know, it looks like you got a full-time job there at Capitol Books. So you've been busy, huh?
Well, since I retired, my wife was like, get out of my way. So she sent me off to go do something that would just get me out of her office and bugging her. So this seemed like the easiest thing to do since I don't really have any hobbies.
Oh, man. So it just seems like such a like an undertaking. Everyone's like, oh, you should write a book. You should write a book. And then you kind of sit at your laptop and you got the blank screen just staring at you. Kind of like, how did you start? And like, how did you, decide what to write on, what the book would be about?
Well, I do a lot of panels and I do a lot of mentoring. And what I loved about the Capitol, and I'm sure you did too, is all the war stories. And we don't really teach it like that anymore. Because you learn values, you learn techniques, you learn strategies based upon all the old war stories of what happened in the past. So I would do these panels and I'd do this mentoring. I'd tell these stories about either Judy too or whatever. And I sort of got tired of saying the same story. So I kind of like, well, maybe I should just put it into a book. And then that way I could just say, read the book, as opposed to continue to repeat myself because I get tired of listening to myself talk about it.
And so when did you start working on the book and kind of when did you finish it?
So it actually only took me 30 days. I retired in March of last year, 2022, I think. And I just had like a bunch of stuff to just clear off the decks. I had a huge honey-do list that my wife had set up for me, fix the shed, do all those types of things. And then I got all that stuff cleared off the deck. And then I had nothing to do, and I was kind of bothering her because she had been retired for 6 years. So she has a normal life now, and I didn't know what to do. So I would just kind of tag along and annoy her. So she kind of said, no, you got to go do something. And I didn't have any ideas other than to just start writing. So I got it done in 30 days. And then it took another 3-4 months to get the cover, get the editing, all that type of stuff.
Yeah, so how'd you get a publisher and the binder and kind of all that stuff?
Actually, publishing is very democratized now. You can write the book, and then there's so many different platforms where you can just upload it. If you wanted to just do it on Amazon, you can actually upload it as a Word document into Amazon, and it'll all of a sudden a book will pop out. So I independently published, but they say that you shouldn't just say, self-publish. You should create a publishing company. So I created a publishing company just in case I decided to write more books about politics. Wow. And then I published it under that imprint because otherwise, unless you're famous, it'll take maybe 2-3 years to get an agent, get a publishing deal. Right. And I really wrote this because of two real main things. Is one, that the Asian American community is at an inflection point because of all of the things that it's experienced politically. And then also, I think, and you experienced a little bit of this, is that the legislature and California politics is also at an inflection point where you have massive turnover of legislators, massive turnover in staff, and there's really nothing, very few things that outside of, say, Chris McKaylee's books that curate the contemporary legislative experience and political experience in California. A lot of stuff is like Woolley Brown days or even further back, and those are great reads, but nothing really talks about contemporary California politics.
Right. That's what I was about to say. Like, I love the Jess Unruh books or the Willie Brown books or, Game Changers, but it's all like statehood to like 1960s, 1970s. There's nothing that captures kind of the 80s, the 90s, 2000s that well. And kind of you got it here a bit, especially kind of from like an API perspective, which, as you kind of talk about in your book, when you first got here, there was no API representation or perspective kind of being addressed in Sacramento. So that's pretty cool. Just kind of like your background, like you kind of go in there in the beginning, but like you were literally born in China and you immigrated here as a baby. Like what part of China was your family from, and kind of What made them come to, Northern California?
It's actually a fabulous story. So I was born in Hong Kong. I was the only one in my family born in Hong Kong. So what had happened is the rest of my family lived in Canton, what's known as the Canton province now, in a small village. And my father was a factory foreman, and it was run by communist China. And it was at a very difficult time in the 50s and 60s, where there was a lot of famine, there's a lot of poverty. So the family wanted to escape China, and the Communist Party allowed my mom to immigrate to Hong Kong as kind of like a intervening step to immigrate to the United States. And my dad was held back. So he actually concocted this elaborate plot that he told us on a trip to Reno one night. It was his birthday. So my brothers and I decided for his birthday at 10 o'clock at night, drive him to Reno. We'd gamble all night. Well, they would gamble all night. Me and my older brother, we were both underage, we spent all night at the bowling alley.
Right.
And then on the way there, he told us about how he escaped communist China. So he got to Hong Kong, and then I was born. So obviously the reunion in Hong Kong created me. And then we immigrated to California, where my grandfather had established a very small restaurant in Marysville, a very small rural town, in, I think, like the 1940s or something like that. So this was all part of Kennedy's family reunification process for immigration. So that's how we got here.
So do you have dual citizenship today, or?
I used to have dual citizenship with the United Kingdom because I came from Hong Kong, but ever since they reverted back, then no, I'm 100% nationalized U.S. citizen.
And so basically, you grew up here. You were born in Hong Kong. Do you speak Cantonese? Did your family speak a lot of Cantonese growing up?
Growing up, I didn't speak any English, but then, like many Asian American families, the parents really wanted us to integrate, so they had us stop speaking our native language in order to do better in our studies. Right. So I lost it, but then much later on in life, I would get into these arguments with my mom about managing the family and things like that, and she would pretend not to understand me because I spoke in English. So that I went through this arduous journey of relearning the language so I could win these arguments.
That's funny. It was kind of like a throwback, kind of reading your first chapter. You're kind of talking about like watching TV as a kid, and I remember like TVs used to be like actual furniture, like with the big wood and the tube, and you'd actually have to like get up and change the channel. So that was pretty interesting. But what was it like kind of growing up in Marysville as a Chinese immigrant? Like it's like a real rural community. I couldn't imagine there'd be a big Chinese presence up there. Like what was it like?
It's strange, but that's all I knew. And at one point in time, it did have a significant Chinese population because it's so close to Sutter's Fort and gold and all of that type of. And then there's rice farms, so there's a lot of Chinese influence in that area because of its geography. But I was one of 5 Asians in the school at the time, so there definitely were feelings of like, do I really belong here?
Right. And it was kind of interesting. You kind of talk about like, media at the time and kind of like, identifying with some shows and, a lot of, I guess portrayals of Asian characters weren't necessarily positive. Kind of how did that kind of reflect kind of growing up and how kids would treat you and stuff like that?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of, being made fun of. There's a lot of bullying. I don't hold a lot of animus toward because it's just, circumstance of how life is. But, it was difficult, and I did have a struggle with identity for the longest time, trying to figure out where I fit in, who I was, what did it all mean, why I wasn't like everybody else, that type of thing. And it does make you ask a lot of questions. And then also there were times early on where it was difficult and embarrassing to be different.
Mm-hmm. And so your family had a restaurant, right? Were you working in the restaurant?
Oh yeah, everybody. Yeah.
Is it still going?
No, they retired after I think like 50 years of doing it. They had been doing it for quite a while, and actually, this is probably odd, but I would recommend everybody work in a restaurant because I got to meet people from all walks of life. I waited on tables and. You see everybody who, people who are doing okay, and then people who are like, this is like their 1 month out, like evening out that they have once a month, and they save up for it, they get dressed up for it, and they go out. And this is like a small rural town. So when I say dressed up, it's not like limo dressed up, but, they get on like their nicest like church clothes and they go out and eat. And then you really see the world the diversity of the world that's out there and everybody's experience, and you learn how to listen and talk to people.
So do you know how to cook?
No.
No, all that time in
Yeah,
the restaurant.
that was my dad. I just waited on tables. I am a phenomenal dishwasher. Like, you put me anywhere, I can get the dishes done.
Okay. Well, hopefully your wife is listening. Yeah, she.
Oh no, she
Yeah.
that like yeah, that's probably why she married me. It's like he washes the dishes.
Yeah.
Like, that's kind of pathological with me.
So it's kind of interesting. So it seemed like one of the like I guess fundamental parts of your youth, or something you really remember, is high school football in Marysville, and you weren't a big guy. Kind of what made you want to play football there in Marysville and kind of stick with it? What drew you to it?
Well, my best friend wanted to play football, so I was like, it's peer pressure.
Mhm.
I was 135 pounds soaking wet, was not good at it. But I write in the book how I ran track and then I quit, and I felt really bad about quitting. I didn't want to be a quitter, so I'd like determined that no matter what, I would survive this, not really knowing what I was getting into. And you're out in Marysville, gets up to like 112, 117. You're wearing pads, you've got a helmet on. It's just a horrible kind of experience. And I struggled through it, but it really gave me, I think, the grit that may help me survive in politics today.
Yeah, they always say mental toughness. You need
Yeah.
that mental tough. So were you fast? Did you have any traits that?
No,
like,
I sucked at everything. Yeah, I was just, the only thing I was good about, I read a little bit in the book, is that I was very good at taking pain, like getting hit hard. And this was particularly interesting because I played cornerback on the team. And we ran in a league where everybody ran wishbone, which basically pulling guard, the fullback, and then the tailback comes at you. And if you're the cornerback, you have to drive the play to the middle where all the big people are. So I would have to sacrifice my body by taking out whoever the furthest one out was and pushing the play in. Which
set
meant,
the edge, yeah.
Yeah. So I did like plastered every game. Yeah, but in no glory. I don't get the ball. I don't get touchdowns. I just go there, get hit by the guy on the outside, so everybody has to run toward the inside.
And it's interesting. You talk about in the book kind of like how you kind of were like an inspirational kind of like mascot, because what you guys would do, I guess, I don't know, we would call it like the Oklahoma drill, where you'd have like a one-on-one, somebody would run, and then, basically they would have to tackle you, or you would have to tackle them, and you would purposely seek out some of the bigger guys, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was one way to, that I felt like I could contribute to. I think we weren't a bad team. We didn't have like superstars, but we had like really decent players who played really hard. And I think that it was more about attitude. And I think that applies to life. It's like how you approach it. You can't always be a winner. You can't always have all the best of everything, but it's that, that fighting spirit that I think that really determines, how people see you and how successful you are.
Yeah. And I guess the cool part is what your football coach, basically what he wrote in your yearbook, kind of like, I don't know what you're going to become, but you're going to become something special, right? Something like that, right?
Yeah, he said, I won't wish you luck because I know you'll do well and you're the most inspirational person I know, or something like that. And he had a really tough time. I mean, he was, he was an amazing coach. Like, we would get to the field, he'd already been doing he'd be running 40s. And if anybody's ever run 40-yard, sprints as an exercise, it is really an unpleasant situation. But he was out there running 40s. I would see him in the weight room working out, and he was actually a math teacher during the day. And he would get all of this criticism from the parents because we had a decade of not winning games, and he was doing his best. He was an inspirational guy, and he really believed in us, and he helped us build that character that ended up our senior year being like tied for third in the league.
So did you get to go to the playoffs then when you're tied for third?
No, small school thing. There wasn't like, you have to be like the winner to go into the state kind of system. Yeah.
So, you graduate from high school, and then kind of where'd you go to college?
I went to UC Davis.
At UC Davis, stayed close, and what did you study?
I spent the first 3 years studying engineering and realized that I was horrible at math and slow, because it took me 3 years to realize that. And I went down the course catalog to look for the major with the least amount of units to graduate, and it was political science.
Whoa, bingo.
Yeah, bingo. Fate intervened. Yeah.
And so what's your family thing? Like, a common thing we hear from API electeds is their parents want them to be a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, a very, good professional degree, and then when they tell their parents I want to go into politics, they are disappointed. Kind of how did that go with your family?
It didn't go well. I was talking to Pamela Wu this weekend, and she said we were joking about that exact same thing about how there's 4 career paths for the typical Asian American kid: either doctor, engineer, lawyer, or failure. And I was the failure. So my dad was disappointed. Like he had a heart set on me being an engineer, and all of my other siblings did really well in school, and they've got PhDs and double masters and all that type of thing. But ultimately, I think they just came to be satisfied that I wasn't starving and that I lived a decently comfortable life with the career choice that I chose.
Yeah. So you go to UC Davis, you graduate with a political science degree, and then every one of us with poli-sci degrees can tell you the hardest thing is then what do you do with it? How do you get a job? So kind of what was your first job kind of coming out of college?
It was an accident. I did an internship with May Lee Tom and Georgetta Mira in Senator David Roberti's office. They ran the Office of Asian Pacific Islander Affairs, and they basically were the interface between the pro tem and the state's Asian American community.
And so that's kind of how you got your foothold here in the Capitol. And kind of what was your first job working for a member?
My first job working for a member, I was a Senate fellow, so I worked for Senator Leroy Green, who was legendary in many different ways. And then I worked for Lenny Goldberg, who was a lobbyist. And then I worked for Hilda Sleece. And then I worked for Mike Honda, and then went back to work for Hilda Sleece. And then I worked for Judy Chu. And then I was a consultant for a long time. And then I worked for Anthony Rendon.
Yeah. So, in your book, you kind of like, each kind of politician you work for, you kind of have a chapter. Like, so you have like the Mike Honda chapter. Kind of talk to us about how you got to work for Mike and kind of what you remember working with Mike about.
I think the key thing about Mike and about a lot of these stories is that when you don't see a lot of people that look like you can't just go out there and say, well, the demographics is this, and there needs to be fairness, and hope that some amorphous entity says, oh, well, let's just give this person a seat because they're not represented. If you want a seat at this particular table, you have to win it. And it doesn't really matter anything else. You just have to win the campaign. It doesn't matter if it's fair or not fair, or right or not right. Mm-hmm. Not to say that those things are bad, but if you want a seat at the table, you basically comes down to you just have to win a campaign. So in a lot of ways, that's even more democratized, right? Because you don't have to go and argue like some higher entity to say, okay, now you're bequeathed like a king, and say you're now bequeathed a seat at the table. Right. So you would just win a campaign. So at the time, it was about, okay, well, if we want more Asians, then we have to get them elected. So Senator Sleece at the time had endorsed Mike Honda. I had volunteered for Mike Honda, and he won his race, and he came in, and then he offered me a job.
It's interesting. Like that's one of the things you say in your book is, if you want a seat at the table, you have to earn it. And kind of you always hear over the Capitol, oh, we weren't invited. We didn't have a seat at the table. We were excluded. Mm-hmm. And then that's something that really resonated with me, because, that's something we hear a lot. And it's kind of interesting, like your job with Mike Honda basically paved the path for your next job with Judy Chu, right? Mm-hmm. And kind of something that I'd never even heard about of appointments and kind of, getting the assembly involved. I always love kind of getting in the weeds of rules and how you can always find something, in the book that nobody else sees. Kind of, where did you guys kind of do the research on how, as an assembly member, you could affect a Senate, confirmation process?
Well, like everything else in your experiences, you have to somebody has that information. So right. We went to Dodson and say, well, what's the process? Yep. And, now, I mean, there's experts like Brian Ebert, or, I think that's one thing that people really miss out is like, there's this treasure trove of information that is out there, and they're not going to go out there and toot their own home, because that's not how we used to be. But if you find them and you ask them, they'll be willing to tell you what happened and spell it out to you, because unfortunately this stuff isn't really curated in books or any type of training. A lot of the people that work in the legislature, there isn't any formalized training right. for it.
It's kind of interesting because basically, Mike Honda was one of the first APIs elected in a long time. It's kind of like the spawn, the seed of what started of what we have today, where we have, all these statewide officers, you have a bunch of representation in the Assembly and the Senate. And it's funny, it's like it started with Mike Honda, which led to the appointment of Judy Chu, right? Which then helped her win her Assembly race.
Right.
That was pretty cool.
Yeah. Well, and I think that it's not uncommon, because where I learned all this type of stuff was watching the Latino and Black community. I mean, Esteban Torres and Gloria Molina and Art Torres, all of the stuff was the initial incubator for the Richard Polancos. And then Richard Polanco came in and built an even bigger machine and got even more Latinos elected. And watching all that occur, it's like, oh, I get it. It's the long game. It's not just like one-offs.
Right.
It's like you're building.
You got to plot along.
Yeah, plot along and move all the pieces around. And that's why the Latino caucus is so powerful.
It's interesting. It's like I don't know, at least especially 10 years, you would hear that APIs just like to vote for APIs. They're not really political one way or another. I guess they have traditional conservative values, but they'd vote Democrat as well. And then you see that over here now. You have Republican APIs, you have Democratic APIs. And I guess a lot of them didn't vote or wouldn't vote. Kind of what was the challenge in first kind of recognizing the API community, getting them involved in politics, and understanding how to get them to turn out.
I think that has changed over the years. I think in the beginning, a lot of API immigrants came from countries where politics was very corrupt or seen in a very negative way. So a lot of the new immigrants didn't participate, and then they didn't pass that along to their children who went through the system. They just went through an education system and became very apolitical. But in the previous 10 years from now, I think that trajectory has changed pretty significantly. And if you ask Paul Mitchell, you'll find that APIs are turning out at the same rate as other ethnic communities, and in some cases slightly more, because they see more APIs in that space and they have more API candidates to vote for, and there are more issues that are starting, like for example, in the last 2 cycles, all of the anti-Asian hate really coalesced a lot of the Asians to vote Democrat, even though there are significant numbers of API Republicans. You see definitely where they split on, where they cross party lines on issues, are on the issues of discrimination and hate crimes, as well as on abortion. And those two were the big things nationally in the last 2 election cycles. So overwhelmingly, with the exception of a few cases, the API community voted Democrat in the last two cycles.
Oh, interesting. And, one thing that kind of, was surprising to me was, when you worked for Judy Chu, she had a 6-year term there as assembly person. And how much you guys accomplished in those 6 years? How many years was she a appropriations chair? 4?
She was, I think, 2.5.
2.5.
Yeah.
Wow. So it's interesting. You talk about kind of, how she got the appropriations appointment, kind of what you guys were able to accomplish, and how you kind of helped her accomplish that by kind of taking a back seat and kind of, helping her instead of, looking out for the best of yourself. I thought that was pretty interesting.
Well, I learned that from football. It's like you got to take the hit so that somebody else can, get into the end zone, and
right.
that's kind of what it's about. And that's what made it fun, because you can see the fruits of the strategy and see the accomplishments. And I think that's one thing that I really think that a lot of staff today struggle with, is that I think they're asking, why am I here? And then, the conversations around pay, around work-life balance, but I really also think that we've kind of lost that type of mission-driven perspective that used to exist in the legislature. And I think that that's just because there's so many new members, there's a loss of a certain perspective or culture in the building. And there's really never enough time to really get into the policies that got you into political science or public policy in the first place. You're just kind of grinding through the process. And let's be very honest, you see more works in progress than you see actual substantive bills. There may be 4 or 5 really good, well thought out bills, but everything else is kind of a train wreck going through the system. And if you're a very idealistic staffer, whether you're on the right or the left, it's got to be soul crushing to see some of the trash that just moves along the process just out of inertia.
No, yeah, it is interesting. It's kind of, so they always talked about the 6-year term limits, where, you had a bunch of institutional staff, and that's kind of what, stayed consistent, and the members kind of churned out. And then when we switched to this 12-year model, people were like, oh, we're really going to be able to focus on stuff. We're going to really be able to get stuff done. But it seems like in the last 4 years, we've lost a lot of institutional, knowledge staff. A lot of the staff are retiring or moving on, and you kind of go in the building, and it's very very young, very new, and people aren't sticking around like they used to for careers. They're coming in and out as it goes. So yeah, you are seeing that. You're not seeing the people stick around and staying for 20 years getting a pension. It's a lot more turnover, and it's resulting in kind of less thought out legislation. I think you're onto something there.
Well, it's also it was like a family. In some cases, a warring family. In a lot of cases, the Senate and the Assembly were cousins that hated each other, but there was definitely a personality for each house. And like we were talking about before the show, you'd have these massive potlucks. I remember, when a staffer was sick, we would donate our time to them, even if we didn't know who they were.
Yeah.
It was really had this more community feel. And now it just, at least in the last years before, right before I retired, it felt like it was just a job. And I felt that was kind of a tragedy because it was such a special place to work, and it wasn't perfect. And, we made mistakes all the time, and there were some really unpleasant, things that occurred during those times. But overall, I really felt like it was an institution, and I don't really feel like it's an institution now as much as it used to be.
Right. You talk to a lot of people, and they, even my dad, when he worked over there, he talked about it like every day was like going to Disneyland, because you were going there, you were actually doing something that affected people's lives and hope to make it better. And that's kind of right. You're like that mission driven perspective. That's why people like to work in this business.
Yeah. And it's fascinating. One of the stories not in here is one of my first jobs was working for Housing Committee, and there was this guy named Doug Gillies. He was like a legendary lobbyist, old dude, but had been doing it for a long time. And he had this masterful way of doing things where he would be in the long game. So 2 years out from what he wanted to do, he would get these minor technical changes to these certain codes to write it in an obscure way. And then when he did the big finish, it would refer back to the code. So I was analyzing a bill for Housing Committee, and I didn't understand what I was doing because it referred to a code that referred to another code. And anybody else would have given up, but I was just genuinely confused, and I thought I wasn't doing a good job. So I was determined to figure out what was going on. And this is before technology. So I got this giant piece of butcher paper, and I pasted the entire bill on that. And then I drew lines to the connecting codes, and I still couldn't figure it out. So I brought it to the chief consultant, this giant sheet of paper. It's like almost as tall as I was, like 5 feet tall. And I said, I mapped it all out. I don't know what this is doing. And then his eyes got really big. It's like, oh my God, this is what he was doing. And I thought it was just fabulous strategy that he did a bill that referenced a code that referenced another code so that he could obscure what he was really doing. It was genius.
No, that is genius. Yeah. I'm going to put that in my back of my mind. Yeah, that's something. So you've written the book. You're out for sale now. I see you're spending a lot of time with Capital Books. Kind of, how's it going?
It's going great. I think that you're never going to get rich on the book, but it's a conversation that I feel like needs to be had about the craft of the politics. And I've spoken to people on both sides of the aisle, and we all believe that there should be a craft to this. It's kind of like sports. You may hate the other team, but if you got a good game, that's like really fun. If it's not a good game, then it's not. And you want that rivalry. You want that test of your skills. And it's about having that conversation with people who, really want to learn this craft and really want to have ideas and bring some creativity to what they do and actually do stuff that is going to impact people, constituencies that they care about. Because right now it just seems like we're just kind of just going through the motions.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. If you talk to anyone who works over there during campaign season, going door to door, working the campaigns is like, not a popular thing, but it's something you relish. Kind of why do you like going to campaigns, doing door to door stuff, and kind of, what makes you so effective at it?
One is a great weight loss program. Secondly, it really tells you what's going on and where you're way off and whether or not you're on the right track. And you go into some of these neighborhoods, particularly if you're running a Democratic campaign, you realize what's at stake. And I used to come back from campaigns really more inspired to do work because I know the conditions that they live in, the economic struggles that they're facing, and just the sheer amount of confusion and the feeling that they are not connected to government. And I could relate to a lot of that growing up, not being wealthy in a rural community. Is like we had to rely on a lot of things for government to kind of like public education to be an equalizer for us. And when government isn't working with you, then it's really tough. So when I came back from the campaigns, I always felt more inspired to do the policy work.
What are some of like the most memorable instances you have going door to door? Like I remember I had to go to door a couple times, and I did the census one time, and it like every time you knock on that door, you have no idea what's on the other side, and it doesn't matter what neighborhood it is. It's like you're gonna get an earful for some people sometimes, and it's just like whoa.
Yeah, I walked for Mike Machado once. I walked in, they opened the door, and this giant cloud of marijuana smoke came
Mhm.
billowing out. So that was always strange. And then it's what you see in the streets with regard to, most Democratic districts. You're going to see like unchained dogs and a lot of chain link fences. But you run into those really sweet people who are like super nice, but they're obviously economically struggling.
Yeah.
I had colleagues that came up to the door. Somebody was like holding a knife. It's just really bizarre stuff that you encounter, and they make the greatest war stories for
Right.
us. And I talk in the book how we walk in Hanford, and there was this very inexpensive inn that they housed all the campaign people at, but it was kind of creepy, ghostly
Right.
inn where there's like a hand print at the front desk that they couldn't wash off or paint over. It was just really creepy.
No, no, I read that, but it's kind of funny. It's kind of like those war stories, those events you share, and going out afterwards and kind of telling stories of your door to door. That's kind of like builds relationships over here,
Mhm.
right? And you kind of have memorable moments with these people, and that's kind of what helps you do the work later on, right?
Yeah, if you're a young staffer, you get to spend an entire day with a chief of staff that might be, thinking of hiring you sometime in the future. At one campaign, I walked with a senior budget staffer. I was a junior staffer, and we, got to know each other. And then a few months later, I had a budget ask that he returned my phone call because he knew me from walking precincts. This was in, I think, like in the East Bay
Right.
somewhere. So it's a great way to build the relationships and keep that kind of family feel of the legislature going in, and be in a situation where you're not you're all equals because you're both walking precincts. It's
Right.
not like the chief consultant and ledge aid. You're just trying to get the precinct done.
Yeah. What's pretty interesting is you started the API Small Business Pack. Is that
Mhm.
right? And I guess when you started that was it at 2010?
No, it
Was
actually
it?
started. Well, I didn't start until 2007. It was established in 2005 with the express purpose of helping John Chung eventually become governor.
And I remember I guess going to an API small business pack in 2012,
Mm.
and it was kind of remarkable, kind of hearing like John Chung, Fiona Ma, all these folks kind of talk about their backgrounds and how they got into politics and what they wanted to do, and kind of like the cast you guys had was remarkable. Their backgrounds, their education, their experiences, and to see where you started, years ago to where it is now. Kind of how does that feel to see Rob Bonta as Attorney General, Fiona Ma, all these kind of statewide electeds, and kind of how much it's grown since you started this mission.
There's a tremendous amount of pride and feeling of accomplishment because we went from zero to what we have now, and it seems to be sustaining itself, and there seems to be growth, and there's more representation, and do we still have a long way to go? Yeah, obviously, but politics is the long game, and just having a seat at the table and then seeing like the communities work together, Asians supporting Latinos and blacks, and then vice versa. I mean, it's just a fascinating aspect of politics that is really, I would say, rewarding right now.
Yeah. So kind of as you said, you have to earn the seat at the table. Now that you've earned the seat at the table, kind of what are the things that are benefiting the API community, kind of being engaged and represented?
Well, one of the biggest things is I think it was 2 years ago, the API caucus led the effort to get $167 million in the state budget to address API hate crimes in the state of California. That's the most any state in the union has invested into the API community to address the epidemic of hate crimes that has been really afflicting the community during the COVID era.
This last time we talked, you were doing Project Ronin, you're raising awareness about kind of these API hate crimes. And we were hearing a lot about it in the news 2 years ago. Haven't heard so much about it today. Is it progressing? Is it still a big issue, or what's the status these days?
It's less. I mean, the community has rallied, and now without COVID being as widespread as it was, I think things are starting to move toward normalization. But the interesting thing is that there's this residual awareness from the community now that they have to be more engaged in civic life and in politics in order to prevent something like this from happening again. Even though it's not violence, but one of the disturbing things is that we've started to see several states, Florida, Texas, and I think another state just recently passed these alien land laws that prohibited non-citizen Chinese from owning property, which is unconstitutional, but all perpetuated by this the current geopolitical tension between China and the United States.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like, I guess ever since statehood, we've had this kind of weird back and forth with the Chinese community, and it doesn't seem to ever end.
Yeah, I mean, it is what it is because these are giant, nations, and they all have agendas. There was a recent poll done by Pew, and 48% of Chinese Americans have a negative view of China. So, I mean, but I think people's perception is like there's some type of ethnic loyalty to it when there really isn't.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I studied political science, one of my favorites was like learning about kind of like Japanese politics, Chinese politics, and learning about kind of like their cultural upbringing. And it's a very different culture. We always hear about like Western medicine versus Eastern medicine. It's kind of like you have this kind of Eastern political philosophy that's kind of a little different than someone in Western might think. Kind of how was like your upbringing kind of as a Chinese American, enabled you to kind of look at things differently and kind of take a different perspective at stuff?
It's hard to say. I mean, there definitely are influences, but there's some amazing things in American culture, and that's the beauty of the culture we live in is like this blend. You get to experience such diversity where a lot of other nations are so homogenous that you don't really see a variety. Everybody seems the same, acts the same, but because the United States is so diverse, you actually get to experience a lot of different perspectives. So, I would say that it all is kind of a blend of everything, which is pretty fascinating.
Yeah. So, how many years did you work over in the Capitol?
Well, it's about 30 plus year career that I called quits on.
And so, so you're totally called quits. You're not doing any campaigning, any consulting. You're just out.
I'm out for now. I don't know if I'm out forever because, I'm not dead yet, as the speaker would say. But at the same time, maybe I just need kind of a break until I can get my second win. But, we're in a very odd place politically. Like, where are we going? And, none of us have ever seen this kind of craziness with regard to fake news or disinformation or even hostility. I just read somebody showed up at some congressman's office with a baseball bat and tried to assault staff, and all this type of stuff where like one guy was calling out to Twitter to have people confront Feinstein staff. Like, they're just staffers. It's not their fault. The level of hostility and aggression out there is really disturbing.
No, it is. It is getting weird. Even though at the Capitol we had that alleged shooter and things like that. And it's just, I guess, different times. But, with information and communication, it's definitely a different era. So how's the book sales going? I'm seeing you a lot at Capitol Books. You have a part-time job there, or what's going on kind of the book tour world?
I love bookstores. Ironically, next to my parents' restaurant, there was a bookstore that I spent a tremendous amount of time in. So I have this like huge affinity for bookstores. You're never gonna, unless you're Michelle Obama or Barack Obama or somebody, you're not gonna make a lot of money off of books. But I do love the process of reading. I love I actually enjoyed the process of writing a book. So it's been really fun. It's been really fun having the conversation about the craft of politics and talking about contemporary politics and what kind of lessons you learn, and also having the discussion about leadership. Like, what does that really mean outside of your title and outside of your pay? Like, how do you lead people and how should you lead people? Those are all fun conversations to have. But and sales are relatively good. I mentioned earlier that the average author sells 250 books in a year. So we're at about 750 books sold, which is great. But obviously,
how many signed copies are out there?
I've had 3 events, and there's been probably about like 100 people out of those 3 events. So I think there's like 100 signed copies floating around out there.
First edition signed copies.
Yeah.
And if we wanted to get if people wanted to buy a book, pick it up, where could they go? How could they get it?
They are in stock at Capitol Books on K next to the Crest, or they could buy it on Barnes & Noble or Amazon. They're widely available on all of the electronic platforms.
Well, Bill was generous enough to give us 2 copies. So I'm gonna have Bill sign one of these, and we're gonna give a giveaway off to a lucky listener who wants a copy of Better to Win, signed by Bill himself. Definitely recommend it. Great read of contemporary politics here in Sacramento. And Bill, thank you. And if the Cal Dems need any desk assembly, are you still available?
I'll walk a precinct, sure.
What about the IKEA desk assembly? Though?
The IKEA desk assembly.
Most...
Well, it's kind of stranded cost. Like now I know how to put them together.
Right.
The hardest thing was like deciphering the stupid manual. So now that I've done that, I think, yeah, sure. If you got IKEA desk, I'm happy to be there.
That's pretty impressive because I remember David Pruitt putting the desk up and down. I was like, wow, that's a really nice desk. I was like, it's like IKEA. I was like, that's amazing.
Well, he had the electronic one where you could the other ones were like hand cranked.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, of course, Pruitt would have the best
of course.
Definitely. Well, Bill, awesome. Thanks for joining us. And if our listeners want to get follow you online, kind of where's the best place to check you out?
I'm on Twitter at Bill Wong LLC.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Bill.
Awesome.
Good luck with the sales.
Thanks for having me on.